Hi everyone, and welcome back to Biology 206. This is week 4 and our second lecture, and the topic of this, we're continuing on our evolutionary theme, and we're talking about life histories today. I'm Dr. Jennifer Baltzer, and here we go. Okay, so life histories. The overall pattern in the timing and nature of life history events averaged across all the species, all the individuals in a species. So there's all kinds of questions or all kinds of choices that have to be made about life history. For example, how large to grow, when to begin reproducing. So these decisions have to do with kind of developmental phases, reproductive choices, and timing of mortality. And of course, these life history differences are genetically based and are based on divisions of energy into pools of growth, reproduction, and survival. Okay? So there's all kinds of different pieces that have to do with each of these aspects of a species' life history, or an individual's life history. Okay, and this variation in life history traits within a species, so not every organism within a species, not every individual within a species does all of these things at exactly the same time or the same rate, and that variation within species in those life history traits is really the fuel for the traits upon which natural selection acts, and it's determined both by genetics. It's determined by genetics, but also can be impacted by environmental conditions. Okay. So, as I mentioned, life history is really closely linked with natural selection, and genetic variation in life history traits within a species is really what natural selection acts on. And so we know, having looked at the distribution of some different traits, that there's variation. Some species have low values, some species have high values, there's variation around a mean, and it's that variation that natural selection acts on. So, within a species, certain life history traits will lead to improved fitness. In other words, improved survival and reproduction. So fitness is the genetic contribution of an organism's descendants to future generations. And so this is both a function of the reproductive rate of the parent and the survival of the offspring. So when we think about traits and natural selection, certain traits will enhance the fitness of an organism, enhance its survival, enhance its reproductive output, enhance the survival of its offspring, and those traits will be favored within a population. Okay, and this links back to what we were talking about in our last lecture in terms of these different selective processes and ways that traits can that can change through time in a species. So this leads to evolution toward maximum fitness, but we know that there's no perfect life history. There's no organism that is able to be the best at reproduction, growth, survival, all of these things. There's a lot of trade-offs that happen amongst those different life history traits, and those trade-offs are what we're going to focus most of this lecture on. And we already heard a little bit about trade-offs in our last, or I think it was the last lecture, or maybe a couple of lectures ago. But we'll look at what these mean, where a high value of one trait often means a low value of another trait. Okay, so an important component when we're thinking about life history traits, an important component is this aspect of phenotypic plasticity. We know that there are genetic differences in traits amongst populations, amongst individuals within a population, etc. But there's also this component of phenotypic plasticity, or the ability of a single genotype to produce different phenotypes under different environmental conditions. And so if you had genetically identical individuals and you grew them under different climatic conditions or different resource environments, that they would produce phenotypes that differed somehow, depending on the resource, depending on the environmental conditions, okay? So this is phenotypic plasticity. And it's that response within an individual to different growing conditions, okay? Now, another important consideration is allocation. When we're thinking about the trade-offs that happen in life history traits, either within a species or across species, we need to think about allocation, and this is the relative amounts of energy or resources that an organism devotes to different functions, those functions being growth, reproduction, and survival, okay? And so a great example is here with ponderosa pine. We can look within this species at changes in allocation in response to an environmental condition. So the climate. So we have we have populations of ponderosa pine growing in two different climates, a cool, moist climate and a desert climate. And what we see here is that we have various measures of growth-related life history traits. So here we have leaf mass, so the amount of foliage in the canopy of that tree. If you took all of the leaves off of that tree and measured them, you would get your foliage, your leaf mass in kilograms. Our tree height, so the height from the ground to the top of the tree. Okay, how tall you are is really important in forest environments because it means you're better able to compete for light, for example. But it also comes at a cost because it means you have to move water up your stem to higher heights, and that is challenging because the water is placed under increasing tension as it gets taller. And if you remember our water potential discussion, that component of water potential, that tension, acts to reduce the water potential and make it harder for water to move up the tree. Okay, so, and then on the x-axis for each of these, we have trunk diameter in centimeters. So that's the, if you took a tape and measured around the outside of the stem of the tree, that's your tree diameter. And we typically do this at what we refer to as breast height, diameter at breast height. And so this is a measure, a standardized measure that we use in trees. Okay, so we have trunk diameter plotted against leaf mass, trunk diameter plotted against height. And what we see in both of these examples is that our desert climate population tends to be shorter at any given trunk diameter. So you see this downward shift. We have these linear relationships between height and trunk diameter for both species. So in both cases, as the tree gets larger, the tree also gets, as the tree diameter gets larger, the tree also gets taller. That's what we expect. But in the desert population, we see shorter trees at a given trunk diameter. So if we think about 10, we look up here, the height of the desert population is shorter at a 10 centimeter trunk diameter than the height of the coastal population. Same thing goes for leaf mass, and also that's not surprising because if we have a taller tree, it often has more foliage. So at our given trunk diameter, once again, we have less foliage in the desert population than in the coastal population. And there are really good reasons why that's the case. There are morphological changes that organisms make in response to environment. In this case, one of the ways that plants respond to drought stress, so desert climate versus cool, moist climate, is to reduce the leaf area that they have. And what that does, if you remember back to our discussions of photosynthesis, is it reduces the photosynthetic area, which when we're thinking about water is really important. It reduces that transpirational surface area. Okay, so the lower the leaf area, the less leaves you have, the less water you lose, which is really useful in a desert climate. Okay. And likewise, like we just talked about, if you're a little bit shorter and squatter in a desert climate compared to a cool, moist climate, it comes with some advantage because the water potential, the tension that water gets placed under as it's pulled up through a tall tree is much greater than the tension it's put under when it's pulled up through a shorter tree. Okay, and so the likelihood of what we refer to as embolism, where that water cannot be, the water column in the xylem vessels cannot be maintained, it's more likely to happen if you're taller in dry environments. Okay, so these are examples of both plasticity in traits, in life history traits within a species, and a great example of changes in allocation that come in response to environmental conditions. Okay, and typically when we think about these kinds of changes, in this case morphological changes, but there would also be physiological changes we can measure these populations. They tend to help with maintenance of function in the environment. You know, that typically is the reason why an organism responds plastically to some environment, is to help alleviate stress. We've talked about this in previous lectures. Okay, so in our previous example, we saw this sort of continuous range of variation in traits that varied amongst populations in a fairly continuous fashion, but that's not always the case. Phenotypic plasticity is not always continuous. There are cases where we see discrete forms, and we refer to these as morphs. And a great example of this comes from these tadpoles of the spadefoot toad. And to look at these, you would think that they were different species, but in reality, it really has to do with what they're feeding on in their early developmental stages. So early in development, if they're feeding on detritus at the bottom of the pond, they mature or they develop into this omnivorous morph of the tadpole. If they're feeding on fairy shrimp in the water column, instead, they develop into this carnivorous morph. Okay, and you can see that they're very, very different in terms of their mouth parts, in terms of their appearance, and there are differences in the way they develop as well. The carnivorous morphs are able to grow faster and mature to an adult toad faster, and this is a real advantage in ephemeral ponds when the ponds actually dry up. So the faster you can move from this aquatic phase to the terrestrial phase, the better off you are in these ephemeral ponds. In contrast, the omnivorous morph, it's slower growing, it takes longer to reach maturation, to reach that adult form, to become a toad, but the survival of young toads of the omnivorous morph are higher. So when we're not talking about an ephemeral pond, when we're talking about a pond that is more stable, this morph can be really advantageous. And so we see differences within species that are really discrete like this. Okay, and these involve trade-offs, right? So the omnivorous morph is not going to do very well if it does not compare to the carnivore in terms of its growth rate, but its adult survival rate is higher. And so there's this trade-off between rapid growth, rapid maturation, and survival. And we'll see this survival versus growth trade-off pretty repeatedly as we move through this lecture. Okay, so one thing it's really useful to think about, I mean, if you recall, we've already talked about the fact that not all traits are adaptive. And a lot of times we talk about, you know, when we see differences between populations and their traits, we talk about adaptations, and that's a little bit of a problem to do that, because not all traits are adaptive. And there are certain ways that you can actually show whether a trait or whether a response to some environmental factor is indeed adaptive. So remember that not all plastic or not all plastic responses and not all trait differences that you see between populations, for example, or between species are necessarily adaptive life history traits. So just very quickly, the way you do this, and this is, if you're interested, this is taken from a paper in Methods in Ecology and Evolution. The citation is there, but there are a few ways to do this. One is using reciprocal transplantation. This is the absolute best way to do it. It's really hard for some organisms though, and this is why we have trees here in this picture. It's a hard thing to do with trees. But what you do with reciprocal transplantation is you have genotype A and genotype B. We could think about those as two different populations, maybe growing in different environments. And you have site A, genotype A comes from site A, genotype B comes from site B, and you plant both of those genotypes or both of those individuals from both populations in both places. So what you would expect is if the traits that we observe in genotype A are adaptive, that it will outperform genotype B. There will be some fitness advantage to the traits that it has in its home environment. So we call this a home field advantage, right? Same thing with site B. Genotype B should be able to outperform genotype A when they're in the site B conditions where it has where it has grown and developed the suite of traits that it has, assuming those traits are adaptive. Okay, so this is how you test for adaptive advantage of traits. It's really hard to do. It's very costly and labor intensive. There are very often ethical and legal issues. Thinking about populations that span political borders, for example. There are all kinds of biases that can come into play and challenges, but this is really, if you want to show that adaptive advantage, that's how you do that. Another way that people do this that's a little bit similar and a little bit simpler also is through common garden studies. And so this is where you take those genotypes, so genotype A, genotype B, and you plant them together in what we refer to as a common garden. Or if for animals, you grow them under common conditions. Okay, and so if you see differences when you grow these two genotypes together under the same environment, if you see differences in their traits, consistent and systematic differences between individuals within each of those populations, then we can infer that there is a genetic basis to those differences. So that's what you can get from this first part of things. Now, the second part has to do with treatments, and so maybe you want to emulate something that you hypothesize is important in site A for dictating the traits of genotype A. And so you impose some experimental treatment on that common garden and can evaluate whether genotype A or genotype B does better under those conditions, okay? So this is simpler than this because you can do this, as a plant biologist, I would do this in a greenhouse setting, okay? So it removes a lot of the challenges that you may have with these nature-based reciprocal transplant experiments. And finally, and this is what this paper is about, in some long-lived organisms, it's really hard to do this work because you can't get to a point where you're actually measuring fitness for many, many years. I work with trees. It takes a really long time for trees to get to reproductive maturity for many species. So one way that people are starting to think about this for trees is using virtual transplants. And so they're using tree ring-based relationships between tree ring width, which indicates growth in temperate and in seasonal climates, and climate, and looking at for different populations under comparable climate conditions through time, you can actually evaluate the performance under those climate conditions, and so get at some inferences of the kinds of things you might get from these reciprocal transplant and common garden experiments using this much less invasive method. So this is something that is, a fairly new method, and also something that is really only applicable for certain organisms where you can quantify those growth changes through time. But these are the mechanisms by which we actually evaluate adaptation or an adaptive benefit to a trait. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of these trait trade-offs we're talking about, and a first and big one is mode of reproduction. This is a really fundamental life history trait, and we have two main modes of reproduction, of course, asexual and sexual reproduction. Some species can do both. So here we have a reef-forming coral where the larva settles and forms a polyp. That polyp buds using asexual reproduction, forming these colonies of individuals, and so once that colony is mature, it releases gamete clusters that contain both eggs and sperm, and the cluster breaks up, the sperm fertilizes the eggs, and a new zygote is formed, and the cycle is repeated. So we have these mechanisms of sexual and asexual reproduction, and sexual reproduction is a really, really common mode of reproduction, an effective mode of reproduction. And okay, so here we're going to talk about the cost of sex, which in your book is also entitled The Cost of Males. And so you can imagine a situation where you have individuals, or you have a species that can have sexually reproducing individuals. So you have females mating with males and producing additional individuals. And females, and asexual individuals, where females produce more females. Now, each female can produce 4 offspring, can only produce 4 offspring. We'll give those rules. And so you can very quickly see the implication of asexual versus sexual reproduction. Only females can produce offspring. And so as a consequence, the population growth of sexual individuals within this species is much slower than the population growth of asexual individuals within this population. You can see here, you know, in one generation we have 4 individuals produced, but the population, so the fraction of the asexual population composed of females increases through time, because each female in the asexual population produces 4 females, and those 4 females each go on to produce 4 more females. The females in the sexual population, assuming a 50-50 sex ratio, produce 2 females and 2 males. And so the growth of the population over here is slower than the growth of the population over here. And so very quickly in this hypothetical population, the percentage of individuals in the of asexual individuals in the population rapidly increases and eventually approaches 100%. Okay, so in these sexual populations, you tend to have slower growth rate than in asexual populations. Some other challenges is if you have a really an individual that's really well suited to the environment, if you reproduce asexually, you pass on all of those good gene combinations. So if you have really favorable gene combinations, you pass those all on to the next bunch of females. In the case of sexual individuals, of course, you're only passing on half of your genetic information, and so you have the potential to lose favorable gene combinations. So these are kind of some of the disadvantages of sex, or the cost of sex, so to speak. So, why do we see sexual reproduction so frequently? And a lot of it, and it has to do with this aspect of recombination that we talked about in our last lecture. So, it's genetic variation generated by sex is incredibly beneficial in challenging environments, and in nature there's a lot of stressful environments. And so a great example from your textbook has to do with populations of this nematode, C. elegans. It's a model organism, for those of you interested in that sort of thing. One of my colleagues works with Drosophila melanogaster, that's another model organism. Another of my colleagues works with Arabidopsis thaliana, that's another model organism. This is a model organism as well, C. elegans. Okay, so with this model organism, they've been able to manipulate it so it can either outcross or not outcross, okay? So either sexually reproduce or asexually reproduce, or self-reproduce. And so what we see is that under a normal population situation, you only have about a 20% rate of outcrossing when you have these individuals that can select to outcross or not. Okay? But when we expose them to this pathogen that's really, that leads to high mortality rates, all of a sudden the frequency of outcrossing in the population increases and in fact begins to approach 100%. And so we see when there's a real stress in the environment, the advantage of sexual reproduction, and this is demonstrated here in terms of the population surviving. When we have our wild type that is outcrossing, it is able to maintain itself in the face of this pathogen, this mortality-inducing pathogen. When we have our obligate selfing version of this, that modified version that is required to asexually reproduce, when there's no bacteria present in the population, it has comparable rates of survival to the sexually reproducing version. When that bacteria gets introduced into the population, you can see here we have generations on the x-axis, population surviving on the y-axis. All of a sudden, the populations of that asexually reproducing C. elegans declines rapidly within, not so many generations. And so we can see the real benefit of having sexual reproduction in the face of a stress, in this case a pathogen. Okay, so the take home from this is that there are trade-offs between sexual and asexual reproduction. Neither is the perfect solution, but both of them have benefits and costs associated with them. And so this is where we talk about trade-offs. There's some real advantages to being asexual. There's some real advantages to sexual reproduction. And a lot of times the advantages, the sort of cost-benefit analysis has to do with, the environmental conditions, the environmental stressors, etc. Okay, so moving on to talk about some additional life history trade-offs. These are really going to focus on resource acquisition strategies and reproductive strategies, not asexual versus sexual, but kind of how much investment are you going to put into reproductive output, okay? And this is sort of one of my favorite examples of life history strategies as a plant biologist and as a plant biologist who measures functional traits. So there's been a lot of work over the last, kind of 20 years, 30 years on what we refer to as the plant economic spectrum. And this is basically a resource strategy spectrum going from acquisitive or more productive species to species that tend to have more conservative traits, more slow growing, etc. So, the tortoise versus the hare situation. So you have slow growing, stress tolerant species versus fast growing, resource acquisitive species, okay? And kind of everything in between. And so that when we talk about a spectrum, it's that kind of continuum from the extremes of conservative to acquisitive and everything in between, okay? And when we think about that in the context of plant economics, there are leaf traits we can think about that relate to growth and tissue survival. And so acquisitive species have certain types of traits that lead to greater, higher rates of photosynthesis and carbon fixation, but come at a cost of their leaves being less well defended, having shorter lifespans, requiring greater higher nutrient availability and higher water use, so requiring more resources to function. So kind of this fast versus slow spectrum. And it impacts a whole range of ecological processes as well. And we can look at the same thing for root traits. And you don't need to know about these particular traits. We talked about them in a previous lecture a little bit. But the idea being that there are suites of traits that are coupled that lead to this strategy, but come at the cost, so that lead to an acquisitive or a high performance strategy, but come at the cost of longevity, high survivorship, etc. So again, this idea of trade-offs. So first we're going to get into some questions about reproductive strategies. And the first is, how many kids, and kids in air quote, is too many, okay? So when we think about having offspring, there's a lot that goes into having offspring once you have those offspring. So energy, resources, time, loss of opportunity to engage in other activities. For example, foraging, or in my case, I don't get to go running as often as I want. No, I'm just joking. But there are trade-offs. There are costs to having offspring that can come at the expense of the survivorship of that parent. Or that can come at the expense of the survival of the offspring. Okay, so if you have too many offspring, it can lead to a situation where you can't provide for them, and survivorship of those offspring decreases. And so then, having too many offspring doesn't necessarily, it doesn't benefit you, because if you have high mortality in your offspring, then those genes are not passing on to the next generation. Remember our definition of fitness, which included production of offspring and their survivorship, right? Those offspring then need to pass on your genes to the next generation. Okay, so here we have an example of clutch size, and so this is, we can talk about the term, your text uses the term lac clutch size. So the maximum number of offspring a parent can successfully raise to maturity. And this was based on some work a long time ago in 1947 by David Lack, where he looked at the successful fledging of individuals in a clutch based on clutch size. And so we can look at this in this figure. So here we have number of eggs laid. And here we have these Larus fucus eggs, number of eggs laid, and the percentage of eggs surviving to fledging. And fledging is when the juvenile birds leave the nest and fly off on their own, right? When they're no longer requiring parental care. And so if we look at the number of eggs laid, when we have a small number of eggs, the percentage of eggs surviving to fledging is high. Okay, so if you don't produce too many eggs, those individuals that actually successfully fledge is 100% in this particular species. Now, as you start to increase the number of eggs that are laid, all of a sudden this survivorship declines. Okay, so all of a sudden you've lost the advantage of, you've put energy into producing those eggs, but they're not leading to offspring. Okay. So, too many offspring can lead to low survival of those offspring, and that's kind of counter to the purpose of reproduction from an evolutionary perspective. Okay, and what about when there's no parental care? So in this first example, we're talking about places where we have parental care, and if you have too many baby birds in the nest, you're not going to be able to get enough worms to them, or whatever the food resource is that you need to get to them. You may not be able to protect the nest well enough against predators, etc. You may die yourself because you're putting too much energy into acquiring resources for them. Okay, so what about when there's no parental care? So there's lots of organisms on the planet that do not invest in parental care. Plants, of course, being a major group, but there's lots of animals and other organisms that do not invest in any kind of parental care. So if the main cost of reproduction has to do with caring for those offspring, then when there's no parental care, we shouldn't necessarily see these trade-offs, but that turns out not to be the case. And so turns out there are still trade-offs, and so we can see this in these sorts of size versus number trade-offs, relationships. And so here on the x-axis we have average seed mass, so that's the size. We can think of seed mass. Here are all kinds of different beautiful seeds from a tropical forest in Central America. This is work published by Helen Mueller-Lando. And you can see some of these seeds are really quite enormous. You can have seeds of tropical forest species that are, this size or bigger. Okay, and what happens in those seeds is that the tree has invested a huge amount into a really nutritive substance within the seed called the endosperm. And that endosperm produces a very large seedling, and B supports that seedling for a very long time. So species of large seeded, seedlings of large seeded tree species will be living off of those maternal investments for much longer than individuals of very small seeded species, where the endosperm is very limited, and the plants have to become independent or fledge much earlier than the seedlings of these large seeded species. Okay, and so you can think of the endosperm a little bit like the yolk in an egg, for example, that provides all the nutrients for that developing embryo. Okay, so we can look at, again, that average seed mass plotted against the number of seeds per plant, and we see this strong negative relationship. When you have a large average seed mass, you're producing many fewer seeds than when you have a small average seed mass. The cost of reproduction is high, and you can't you see we don't have species that are occupying either of these spaces. You don't have species that make small seeds and produce low numbers of seeds, and you don't have species that make large seeds and produce high quantities. These are trait spaces that are not possible because of the trade-offs associated with producing a lot of seeds versus producing a small number of seeds. So again, even when there's no parental care, there's trade-offs associated with how much you're going to reproduce versus the quality of the offspring that you're producing. And the other component of this is that high fecundity is also costly for the reproducing individual. And so you can look at, so this example here is in birds, annual survival rate of birds plotted against annual fecundity. And we can see that where you have low annual fecundity, each of these dots on this graph is a single bird species. So where you have low annual fecundity, you have high annual survival rate. Where you have high annual fecundity, the survival rate is incredibly low, okay? Note the axis only starts here at 0.4, so we range from 40% survival to 100% survival. So trade-offs between the amount you invest in reproduction and what you can invest in your own survivorship, okay? And the same thing holds here in the Pseudotsugo menziesii, this shows us the growth rings, so the annual ring index. So we have the growth rings of these Douglas fir showing here in this beautiful cross section. And this is plotted against number of cones per tree. So the reproductive output, which ranges from 0 to 2,200 cones per tree. That was a lot of counting for someone to do. And what we see again is this strong negative relationship where if you're producing a huge number of cones per tree, your growth rate is reduced compared to those individuals that are producing a small number of cones. So you can either choose to invest your resources as a tree, you can choose to invest your resources into growth or into fecundity, or you can, again, you can choose to invest your resources into fecundity or survival. But we see these trade-offs. You don't in both of these examples, just like our previous example, there's trait space that's not occupied, which demonstrates that there are certain trait combinations that are simply not possible. High annual survival plus high fecundity, it just doesn't happen. High annual growth plus huge reproductive output, not possible. There are trade-offs. You have to choose how to invest the resources you have. Okay, so life history continua. We'll get into this in the context of R versus K selection. We've already kind of alluded to that in some of the previous slides, but this is a great example, this beautiful orangutan mom and her baby, where typically an orangutan mother only has one baby, much like a human mother. And this blurry, now blurry picture, it did not look blurry on my computer, but this blurry picture of like a whole mountain of little juvenile hares in a nest. Without any parent in the picture, right? So lots and lots of offspring versus a single offspring. And so we've already started to talk about that a little bit, but we're going to now move into these continua. So these spectra of trait combinations that vary in a continuous way from the sort of extremes that we see here and everything in between. Okay, so a really common one that we often hear about is R versus K selection, and that's exactly what I was pointing to in that orangutan versus hare example, and we see the same thing here with all of these baby mice. This mom has produced just a huge litter of mice versus this single juvenile whale with single whale calf with the whale mother here in this picture. So there are different ways, again, different life history strategies that you can use, and we often see these kinds of responses. So in those species that are producing huge quantities of offspring, like we see here with the mice, typically what you see happen is that the percent of organisms that are surviving drops off rapidly. So not very many of those individuals that are produced will survive to maturity. Kind of live fast and die young type of approach to life. At the other extreme end is this type 1 curve, or the K-selected curve, which is the approach taken here by the whale, where the survival of individuals through time is very high. You tend to invest a lot in a small number of offspring, and those offspring have a high survivorship, okay? So they're very different strategies, and they lead to very different population growth curves as well. And then of course you have everything in between, and that's kind of depicted by this middle line here. These are kind of two extreme ends, but you have all kinds of different options in between. So yeah, live fast and die young, or slow and steady wins the race. And these are the kinds of traits we see with R versus K selection. So number of offspring is high in R selection, low in K selection. In contrast, the parental care for K-selected species is very high. In R-selected species, it's very low. The time to reproductive maturity, so R-selected species mature very early, K-selected species mature late. Think about humans. Sexual maturation isn't reached until, the age of 12 or 13, whereas there are lots of species that are mature within, within a few months. So size of offspring, R-selected species tend to have small offspring, K-selected tend to have large. The examples of those seeds that we looked at are a great example of that. Those trees that produce those enormous seeds are investing a lot in parental care in some ways, because those maternal resources are supporting that seedling. And the seedling will be large when it comes out of that large seed and have a lot of parental investment, if you consider that endosperm parental investment. Whereas R-selected species will have small juveniles, and so again, small-seeded trees produce small-seeded tree species, or tree seedlings, and those become autonomous, are no longer reliant on those seed reserves very quickly, and so that parental care is low. So even in trees and plants, this applies. Independence at birth, early versus late. Again, think about those seeds. If you don't think this holds true for the plants, reliance on those maternal resources for a very long time after the seedling is actually produced. Lifespan tends to differ. R-selected species tend to have short lifespans and high mortality rates. K-selected species tend to have long lifespans and low mortality rates. So these are the kinds of trade-offs, and so again, those are the extreme ends, and you have that continuum between those two extreme ends in terms of the types of strategies available. But both of these come with different advantages and disadvantages, and different implications when we're thinking about population dynamics, right? If you only produce a very few offspring and they take a really long time to mature, it takes a long time for a population to recover if it is depleted, just as an example. Okay, so plant life history spectra. We've already seen this one. I won't talk through this one too much, but I'll point to it in a moment. The one I want to spend a bit of time on is this Grimes this Grimes triangle, or the CSR. The CSR theory, so competitive, stress-tolerant, ruderal. And so basically when we think about environmental conditions for plants, you can have high and low stress environments, you can have high and low stress, low disturbance environments. And there's 4 combinations of these. So low stress and low disturbance. In that case, you're going to end up with this situation where you have competitive individuals. Growing conditions are good, there's very limited disturbance, and so being able to acquire resources quickly and grow and kind of outcompete your neighbors is going to be a really important component of that. So that's low stress, low disturbance will lead to increasing competition. Low stress and high disturbance is a situation where you end up with these ruderal, so these weedy species. They tend to have short lifespans, rapid growth, heavy investment in seed production, so they tend to have this that R-selected strategy that we just learned about, okay? So they tend to occupy a place where there's a really regular disturbance, but not a lot of stress, so fairly ample resource availability, but just the whole system gets set back very regularly, and so you tend to have these are selected species that occupy that because they can ramp up their population sizes very quickly. Okay, and then you can have a situation where there's low disturbance but high stress, and so you end up with these stress-tolerant type plants. Okay, and they tend to grow slowly. They more commonly have evergreen foliage, slow growth, slow rates of resource use, low palatability to herbivores. So if we think about our gradient here, our competitors up here would be akin to the acquisitive side of that leaf economic spectrum or plant economic spectrum. Our stress tolerators would be over here on that conservative side, okay? All right, and then the fourth combination is high stress, high disturbance, and that's a sort of space that we don't, it's not conducive to plant growth. It's just too much stress and too much disturbance for plants to be able to survive and thrive. Okay, so you can see the analogs to this strategy, and there's a lot of, there are different ways to think about plant life history strategies, but there's lots of commonalities between them, and you can kind of overlay them on one another and see where they're similar and different. Okay, when we're thinking about life history strategies, one of the challenges is that there tends to be a correlation between lifespan, so how long you live, and your age at sexual maturity. So we as humans are very long-lived organisms, and we reach sexual maturation at a fairly old age compared to many species, many shorter-lived species. And so there is this relationship, and we can see that depicted in these four different colored lines that correspond to fish, lizards, snakes, mammals, and birds. And so these are sort of broad groupings of taxa that have strong similarities amongst them. And so the way Charnov suggested was a good way to overcome that was to actually remove the effect. So by removing that effective lifespan, we can compare across taxa that have different lifespans. And we can see, for example, that in general, ectotherms take much longer to reach reproductive maturity than do the endotherms used in this particular example. So by creating these dimensionless ratios, we can directly compare against really diverse taxonomic groups that have quite different life histories. Okay, and finally, just a little link, a little climate change connection, and this is again from your text. Here we have Arctic hare, and the Arctic hare changes its fur color seasonally. It's a phenological change in the species, where in the winter it has white fur to blend in, to camouflage in the snow. In the summer, it molts to a darker fur color to blend in with the environment. And a challenge that we're seeing increasingly with climate change and these life history strategies that are well adapted to their environments but are faced with really rapid changes in their environments is that these life history traits do not necessarily keep pace with ongoing climate change. And so in this example, we have this brilliantly white Arctic hare sitting on this snow-free soil surface in the fall. So the snow is arriving later and later in the fall in many places, but the timing of the shift in fur color is not responding to those changes. And so this can lead to big negative impacts in the population, as these evolutionary processes are not necessarily able to keep pace with the climate change that we're seeing occurring. Okay, and with that, I will leave it. I will leave you for the day, and look forward to chatting with you tomorrow evening. Okay, have a great night.